Insurgent. This is part 2 of a trilogy of movies based likewise on a trilogy of books known as the Divergent series, named for the first entry. At a glance, they may seem like an intimidating tome, but opened up, you'll discover the font is fairly large and widely spaced, making for an easy read, which I decided to do after viewing the first movie, which sadly is not in 3D. It had an intriguing concept, though, about injections and remotely activated mind control. Although I found the first movie fairly faithful to the book, it turned out that that whole story point that intrigued me was only a very small portion at the end. Still, it was an interesting trip. The Divergent series, I think is fair to say, is a loose analogy of the university experience. The first book, you might say, is a transition to institutional campus life. It's kind of appropriate that it concerns attempts at mind control. The second navigates bumpy politics within the walls of the campus. And the third is leaving those walls behind and discovering relationships formed inside may not translate to the outside. People are divided up into categories of various disciplines, which broadly represent ideals of agriculture, law, science, politics, and military. Naturally, anyone outside of that are the bums of this world, to be both pitied and feared, which I think sadly accurately describes the worldview of many educators. Now, there's lots of criticism of the design of this world, but I think that may miss the point of the books entirely. In reading this series, I couldn't help but notice the lines tend to read like, I can't stand it. I can't manage it. I stare down at the pavement. It seems far away now. My throat is dry. I try and swallow. Any action described is really just a framework to show emotional nakedness. Being bare is really at the heart of the book series. But insecurity is tough to film. It's a head game. And unlike the first and final film, part 2 is about choosing who to trust. Even more tricky to film. It's chess. It's a Godfather story. It's Lawrence of Arabia. But who is ever going to film this with that much respect? The movies can be accused of being a clumsy cash grab done as quickly as possible, each released within a year of each other. But you can't really fault them. That's just how it's done. There was only one Kubrick, and everyone else is on a schedule. Unfortunately, only part 2 was given the 3D treatment, which is the main interest of myself. And to that end, I found the stereo image very similar to what I recently described with Love and Thunder. That is, the attention is usually just limited to the foreground, and the background often left flat or near flat. There are many shots like this horse stable where the perspective suggests a stronger depth than what we actually get. Despite that, though, it's not exactly a cardboard cutout. There is some subtle manipulation going on, giving a slight illusion of stereo progression. And for a conversion done in 2015, it isn't too bad. Yes, there was more exciting 3D being done that year, but this is still a competent and convincing 3D experience, despite its numerous shortcomings. For example, on a ledge, we find at least one moment where the background is used for stereo effect, showing the dangerous heights from which characters are plunging. Surprisingly, nature shots were very well done as well. Trees felt separated, branches are not ignored, and blades of grass wave in front of the camera, selling the immersion. The opening chase through the woods was a lot of fun, and a casual glance might have mistaken some moments for being filmed in 3D. On this train, these perforated metal sheets offer up a pleasant array of stereo windows. I think what made them stand out is we get close to them, so they have moments where they are part of that favored foreground where all the stereo detail it can be found. Now, when it comes to reflections, we get this excellent shot early on in the show during a rare moment of peace and serenity. Later, however, during more troubled times, we get a similar reflection in a glass cage that unfortunately is barely distinguishable from the people outside, and it lacks that ghostly translucent feel that looks so good in 3D. Now, this is something of a trial scene where our characters are injected with truth serum. Really, the whole series is constantly injecting some kind of mind-controlling substance. The set has these large mirrors to kind of symbolize their exposed introspection, more nakedness. But unfortunately, they don't have any 3D depth to them. In fact, the camera is shockingly flat any time it pulls back to show this room. However, the close-ups in this same scene seem to be done with a slightly exaggerated stereo, which helps emphasize their discomfort with their forced confessions. It's kind of an ironic moment in that it is a scene taken from the book and probably the closest we get to the spirit of the books, yet you'll find it actually serves little purpose in the overall context of the movie. You could say most of the first 45 minutes of the movie serve little purpose. We visit locations and characters that mean something in the book, but they're introduced for absolutely no purpose within the movie. The rest of the movie is a VR video game. Beat the game, win the prize. It's simple, it's basic. It's not the book, but it is the only time this movie makes sense, so it's not the worst idea. And the game does provide the best 3D moments of the film. In the book, these simulations are just another injection, but here they give us these great slithering neural probes that not only give us some terrific stereo spaghetti, but also they lift up and suspend our character in the air, giving us something of a fish in a bowl effect. And inside the simulations, the stereo fun continues. We get these floating ruins in a weird dreamscape, kind of continuing the whole fishbowl idea. Now, unfortunately, this magnificent scene loses its 3D luster the further we get from the camera, but it's still enjoyable, though it is unfortunate they didn't give this the hyper stereo treatment, as not only would it have looked great, but it would have helped emphasize that it is in fact a simulation. Now, everything inside this game seems to shatter at some point. We get frequent shots of stuff breaking into a million pieces, often in glorious slow motion. And not only does it make for the best 3D moments, but the shattering self, the shattering world, makes for a fair analogy to the book's spirit of insecurity that I touched on earlier. All change cracks our self-identity to some extent. The shattering of oneself might be the most traumatic thing someone goes through. As a song once said, "Lose your dreams and you will lose your mind." Though enjoyable on a visceral level, this last half of the movie takes what should be really deep moments and turns it into something of a gong show. I suspect this might be a better watch if you're unfamiliar with the book. The movie does depict that she chose to be in that position to save others, but in the book, there is no game. This character, Triss is her name, is just being used as a lab rat to develop a weapon in what is essentially a slow execution, which kind of makes the participation of her brother significantly more grievous. And once trapped in the simulations, she wrestles with facing the end of her life. Was it fair to her boyfriend, her friends? Is she wasting the sacrifices her parents made by being there? Namely, is she in this chamber merely because it was right? Or did she choose to be there because it was the only move that protects her identity as a kind of savior? And if so, did that actually make it the wrong decision? A kind of killing herself to hold on to herself, only realized when it's too late. Now, the laboratory system also has futuristic holographic displays similar to what you might have found in Avatar that, again, look fantastic in 3D. Like reflections, they have this ghostly see-through appearance that just stands out and the eyes love to take in. Now, It's unfortunate that the third movie, called Allegiant, was not converted to 3D, as it is absolutely full of this type of glowy future world type stuff. Now, it's not accurate. The books all take place in a Mad Max type world. In fact, a story point in the third book has the group in absolute awe over a single crudely restored airplane that can still manage to fly. But in the third movie, they're flying around in glass spaceships. There's floating buildings, laser guns, and all sorts of drones. It's like they just gave up on the book. Putting it in 3D just might have made it all forgivable. Incidentally, you might have read that this is an unfinished trilogy, that the third movie was meant to be in 2 parts. Although that was the plan, I think the third movie does cover the territory of the third book. Though it does lack the sad and surprise ending of the series, it does have a conclusion that feels like a Hollywood ending. Anything they had in mind for that fourth movie would have just been a simulation.